Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. It is Wednesday, and we're heading right down to the University of Virginia. Jennifer Lawless, the chair of the Political Science Department, joins us. Professor, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to.
Lots to discuss. A little bit of fireworks here in Rhode Island. Yesterday, there was a Board of Election meeting in which they decided to hold off on issuing subpoenas to those who had collected signatures for Sabina Matos's campaign, deferring to the Attorney General and the state police's ongoing investigation. And then there was a follow-up press event by Sabina Matos, the Lieutenant Governor of Rhode Island, who had a New York Congressman in, Adriano Espaillat, from the 13th District. He was in to support her candidacy. Kate Nagle, our news editor, was over there. She was the third reporter, first two male reporters, and then herself, to ask questions. You've seen the video. Walk us through your takeaway as being a leader in the political science field as to what your sense of what took place was.
The level of sexism coming in all different kinds of directions, targeted at various people and by various people, was really quite stunning. I mean, I've spent 20 years studying gender dynamics in congressional elections and in the political arena. And what I saw yesterday sort of summed it all up and in a lot of ways highlighted how far we haven't come. So as you mentioned, it's the issue began when Kate asked a question, and Sabina Matos was clearly not interested in answering it and not interested in talking anymore about the Board of Elections and the signature controversy. But as she began to say that, the congressman from New York decided that it was better for him to just say it. So he literally shushes Sabina Matos. He puts his hand on her shoulder to sort of like hold her in place, but make it clear that she's not supposed to participate. And he basically reads Kate and everybody else the riot act about how Sabina Matos has been victimized and he's not going to let her be victimized again. She then actually went on to give a pretty decent response to Kate's question after all of this happened, but it was just stunning, both in terms of how he stepped in, how when Kate then followed up with her and said, how do you feel as a woman who was just sort of, shushed by this guy? It was just absolutely stunning to watch.
Yeah, listen, it's disappointing. Here's Sabina Matos. She's the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Rhode Island. She's got a controversy. She's got an opportunity to win a congressional seat. And she's not, in any number of instances, including in this one, not defining her own leadership. Is that a problem for her?
Well, it's a problem, but it's been a problem across the board since this entire controversy began, because she never really took responsibility. Instead, she said that she and her campaign were a victim of these rogue signature collectors. And so I think that what happened yesterday and the fact that she totally deferred to somebody who doesn't live in Rhode Island, who clearly is not totally well versed in what happened, highlights that she's not really, setting the narrative and defending herself. But the second thing is, he literally put his hands on her to stop her from participating or from talking, and then highlighted how she is a victim. And so I think that just speaks to a sense of weakness that obviously the Lieutenant Governor of Rhode Island is not weak. She shouldn't be playing a weak congressional candidate on TV. And, I think that that's how this entire thing has unfolded. And yesterday was just the epitome of that. And we had a visual of it. And I think that it's unfortunate. As a woman, I was offended by his behavior. As a former congressional candidate, I was offended by his behavior. And as somebody who's been studying this for 25 years, I was just completely flabbergasted.
My favorite part of the exchange was when Kate continued to press with the same question to Sabina Matos. He kept interrupting her and at one point said, I don't know who you are. And she responded, well, you're not from Rhode Island.
Right.
Go back to New York, Congressman.
Right. I mean, it was not his press conference. The extent to which he took it over and tried to shape the narrative is one thing. But to then sort of determine who gets to ask a question and whether it's a legitimate question and whether she's a legitimate reporter is completely ridiculous. And Matos did not step in and try and, take it back. It was only when he was finished speaking that she felt like she could then, say her piece. And it just doesn't highlight strong leadership, but I think it also highlights how we're still at a point in U.S. politics where, men feel like they can come in and save the day. And a lot of times they make it worse.
Talk about this sort of playing the victim card that her campaign is sort of setting up. He clearly was messaged on this, the congressman from New York. That seemed prepared, that they were going to sort of defend Matos's faux pas by saying that she was the victim, she's being targeted, this is a conspiracy. There doesn't seem to be any conspiracy, the best that we can find out, and we've dug into every congressional campaign pretty harshly. You can ask Aaron Ruggenberg, you can ask John Goncalves, et cetera. Does this work? Does this victiming, claiming to be the victim, does that work for her?
We're going to find out in a couple of weeks. But generally speaking, no frontrunner, and frankly, no candidate wants to be portrayed, or I would think wants to be portrayed as a victim, because one of the qualities that's most important to voters is whether the candidate exudes strong leadership. So leadership, competence, empathy, and integrity are sort of the big four. These are the characteristics that, public opinion polls repeatedly show and election results repeatedly highlight are the most important to voters. And so demonstrating that you're a strong leader, which means being able to take responsibility, which means being able to handle things when they go awry, which means being able to fire somebody on your campaign if they do something wrong, is what voters want to see. They're totally open to the idea that not every candidate is perfect, but they want candidates to be able to identify that they're not perfect, that mistakes were made, and that they've handled them. And allowing literally the word victim to be used, and she's used it, he used it, the campaign has used it, makes it a lot more difficult to push that strong leadership narrative.
It does not look like the regulatory authorities or law enforcement are going to intervene into the questions about the Matos campaign before the primary. I assume it's twofold. One, they're going to claim they have an ongoing investigation. The state police and the attorney general want to take their time. Secondly, they probably, I assume in the back of their mind, don't want to be portrayed as being James Comey-esque, interfering with law enforcement edicts right before an election. And the Board of Election has clearly kicked the can till after the primary. In this race as we see it right now, do you get a sense of which way this thing is ebbing and flowing?
I think that at the end of the day, it's probably not going to matter that much. If she wins, I think it's not going to matter. If she wins the primary, I think this is something that candidates might think about using as a launching pad to run against her in 2024. But if she wins the primary, I don't think that it's really going to matter in November. If the primary is really, really close, or if she somehow comes in second, it's because of this. They might be putting their investigation on hold, but every day that this is being talked about and every day that it's in the news, it's something that's not great for our campaign. She said in her response yesterday, she doesn't want to talk about this. She wants to talk about the issues that matter to Rhode Islanders and the issues that matter to working families. And I get that. That's what all of the candidates want to do. And so it's better every day that she's not talking about that and she's talking about this is a better day for them.
Let's leave Rhode Island. Let's head down to Georgia. Big news on, it's all a blur right now, Monday night, Tuesday night, whatever it was, Monday night, right before about 11 p.m., the word came out that the grand jury in Georgia, in Fulton County, had issued indictments against President Trump, former President Trump, and 18 others within his either administration or political circles relative to a RICO violation and a number of other charges, 41 charges in all. What does this case mean in comparison to the two cases now moving forward by the special prosecutor, Jack Smith, and the charges levied first months ago, which I don't even think anybody even talks about, back in New York back in April? How does Georgia stand out from these other indictments?
Georgia's different and a lot worse for Donald Trump in a couple of ways. The first is that this is a sprawling indictment. And so it's Donald Trump, it's Rudy Giuliani, it's Mark Meadows. It's basically, I read today some analysis, it's an indictment of the Republican Party because there are also dozens of unindicted co-conspirators. So the issue here is that it is not the case like we saw at the federal level, where Jack Smith tried to make as narrow an argument as possible so that he could move this along quickly. This is a long, complicated, story about everything Donald Trump was willing to do to affect the election in Georgia. And all of these key players are vital. So it's far more complex. That makes it a little bit different. The reason that it's bad for Donald Trump is because it's in state court. And although he's going to clearly file to move it to federal court, what it means that it's in state court is that if he gets reelected as president, or if any other president opts to pardon him, they can only pardon him on federal charges. They can't pardon on state charges. And the RICO violation alone comes with a mandatory minimum of 5 years in prison. So this is one of these situations where it's hard to see how he gets out of it. And it's one of the cases with the most damning evidence against him. We've all heard that call. That call alone was illegal. And that's only one of many. The other thing that makes it bad for Donald Trump is that a lot of these people who were indicted are also looking at least a 5-year prison sentence. And so they have far greater incentives to flip and cooperate. Evidence that they can provide to Fani Willis and to the prosecutors in Fulton County are going to go a long way. So it is a bad news day for Donald Trump. It was on Monday and it continues to be.
I know Mark Meadows, the former chief of staff to President Trump, has filed to move this to federal court. Who makes that decision? Is that the judge in this case in Georgia, or a federal court judge?
No, it's the judge in Georgia. And, Mark Meadows actually has a decent argument in a way that Donald Trump does not. So Mark Meadows was indicted on 2 counts, and they were both, he's arguing in his capacity as chief of staff, and that he arranged some phone calls and that he arranged these meetings. And that was his role in the conspiracy. He's saying that arranging those meetings was just the normal wear and tear of his day as chief of staff. And as a result, there's an exception or an exemption that allows federal employees to try and move cases from state court to federal court if they were acting in their capacity as a federal official. And he's going to say the chief of staff was. That's a lot different than Donald Trump. So if anybody has an argument to move it to federal court, and I don't know that this argument will stand, but he's at least got, some compelling, logic there. The rest of them really not.
And they have to offset that with issues like the overwhelming reach of a RICO charge, which says these predicate acts, uncoordinated to one another per se, but took place within the overall effort of the corruption, are tied to this, so that one may not have known exactly what the other one was doing, but the sort of cumulative effect of all of this was a major corrupt act.
That's exactly right. He's basically he was running the White House as a criminal enterprise, similar to, Rhode Islanders will remember when Buddy Cianci was finally taken down. It was, the equivalent of running City Hall as a criminal enterprise. So these are far-reaching charges. The thing that's important to keep in mind here, too, is that in order to be found guilty, you don't have to have been involved in all of the aspects. You just have to have done 2 things. And so, based on the indictment, most of the people who were charged, and many of the co-conspirators who were not charged, did far more than 2 of those things.
Rudy Giuliani, formerly America's mayor, the toast of the free world after 9/11 for his leadership in the New York response to the terror attack, is now reportedly financially in ruins and now under multiple investigation, an unindicted co-conspirator on the federal charges, but also now really in the eye of the storm down in Georgia. How does that play out, and how much trouble is Rudy Giuliani's lack of financial resources a problem for Donald Trump?
Well, in real life, I would say it's a real problem for Donald Trump, but I also never would have expected Giuliani to act the way that he's acted up until this point. Keep in mind, Giuliani was one of the sort of first people to rely on RICO to bring down mob families in New York. So the fact that he's on the opposite side of this now is just, very, very striking. But he certainly has every incentive to tell federal officials, and Fani Willis too, everything that he knows. Now, unfortunately, it's unclear that his cooperation is going to get them much more than what they already have, simply because he was so vocal during this whole thing. I mean, many of the conversations that were had and many of the investigations that wound up taking place were direct results of Rudy Giuliani saying things publicly. So I don't know what additional information he can give, and the extent to which flipping him is a big coup for prosecutors. But
Yeah.
when it's bad when a CNN panel is literally talking about how he could get a public defender.
Yeah, I mean, listen, last time I saw Rudy Giuliani was up on Federal Hill. He was the top crime fighter in the United States of America. He was here to campaign for fellow former U.S. Attorney Lincoln Almond in his effort for governor. And Rudy Giuliani was a superstar. Not only was he the top crime fighter, he was an Italian American who brought great pride to Italian Americans, and how the mighty have fallen.
And also, he has been making the news circuit, obviously, talking about how this is just a violation of free speech. And again, similar to how the First Amendment really did not come into play in Jack Smith's charging document, it doesn't here either. It's one thing to say something. It's another thing to say something that actually then generates a conspiracy or that leads directly to a crime. And so it's just not true that all speech is protected. A lot of speech is protected. Most speech is protected, but behavior is not.
So with 19 people indicted, the Fulton County Attorney General, prosecutor, outlined how she plans on moving this quite quickly. Legal experts say not so fast, pretty difficult to move a complex case like this forward quickly. What happens here? What should we be looking for in sort of the news cycle of the development of this prosecution?
Well, first, she just noted that, I'm sorry, we have a dog that sees nothing but is barking. She just noted that she's trying to, she would like the trial to start on March 4th. So that's 6.5 months. That's very soon. And the other thing that I would note is that they all have until August 25th to turn themselves in. So I would be looking at that over the course of the next 10 days and what kinds of negotiating and deals Donald Trump is able to make, because turning himself in at this point requires a mugshot, it requires fingerprints, and it involves literally going to a county jail that has been the subject of DOJ investigations for poor treatment. So I would be looking at that, and then longer term, the extent to which all of the defendants push back on this March 4th request that she just made.
Listen, Jennifer Lawless, as always, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate you taking the time, your input into what's going on up here in the congressional race and down in Washington and Georgia. We always look forward to. Thanks so much. For everybody else, stay tuned. There is a lot going on. GoLocal is chock full of news today. If you didn't see the afternoon e-blast, very depressing. 3 people shot in one shooting incident in Providence, and in a separate shooting incident, another man hospitalized. So 4 people in 2 different shooting incidents hospitalized in the past couple days. We only learned of it today. We were first to break both those shootings. Seems to be Providence Police is a little reluctant to get the bad news out these days. So stay tuned for much more. We'll have a number of breaking stories tonight, and if you don't know, the Smithfield Little League is playing in their first game in the Little League World Series right now on ESPN, so feel free to switch over now that we're going off the air. Stay tuned, stay healthy, and go Smithfield.